There are parts of history that seem purposefully torn out, as if someone wanted us to forget them. What you are about to hear is not in the usual books, but it did exist. Get ready, because this is not fiction. It is a past that almost disappeared. The Lost Kingdom of Urartu. In a harsh and remote corner of what we now call Armenia, in the valleys and mountains brushing the waters of Lake Van, more than 2,500 years ago, a civilization flourished that most of the modern world has barely heard of. Urartu, a name that echoes like a whisper in the stones of crumbling fortresses, was a mountainous, warlike, and sophisticated kingdom whose remnants sleep among cliffs, terraced slopes, and forgotten tablets. It was a power, a people feared and respected, a culture that spread across the backbone of the southern Caucasus, defying entire empires before vanishing without a sound, like a coal that dies out without flame. The ancient Assyrians knew them well. They called them the Kingdom of Urartu or Nairi in their cuneiform inscriptions, and their northern campaigns were filled with blood and tension against this enigmatic society that knew how to build fortresses like no other. To the Assyrians, Urartu was a rival, not a barbarian without structure, but a strong and organized state, master of monumental architecture, with its own language, a consolidated administrative and religious system, and above all, a culture that did not copy, but created. Urartu was not a footnote in history. It was a full chapter that faded when it still had much to say. Its cities were perched on hills, designed to withstand eternal sieges. They used cyclopean stone blocks that even today, centuries later, remain bonded without mortar, as if time itself had surrendered to their construction. Karmir Blur, Erebuni, Tushpa, Altintepe. Names that do not appear in schoolbooks, but once rang out as centers of power and life. Each city was a statement of strength and vision, and they were not few. Dozens of fortresses dotted the rugged geography of the region, many still not fully excavated, others barely visible under centuries of earth, neglect, and archaeological bureaucracy. The Urartian language, an agglutinative tongue with certain structural similarities to Caucasian languages and somewhat related to Hurrian, comes to us through inscriptions in stone and bronze. They used cuneiform writing, adopted from the Assyrians, but filled it with their own voice, their own words. However, although the inscriptions exist, the knowledge they provide is partial, fragmented. We have no literary texts, no mythology, no written poetry. What we know of them is technical, administrative, military. We know how many oxen were offered to which god, how many soldiers a garrison had, how many jars were transported from one city to another. But of their deep thoughts, their philosophy, their worldview, little or nothing has reached us. It is like seeing the skeleton of a majestic creature, but being unable to imagine its gaze. Religiously, Urartu had an organized pantheon, with main deities such as Haldi, god of war and patron of the kingdom, Tesheba, linked to thunder and storms, and Shivini, a solar god. These gods were not mere symbolic figures, but actively venerated entities with rituals, offerings, and temples built with astronomical precision. The state cult was closely tied to royal power. The king was more than a political leader. He was an intermediary with the divine. In inscriptions, Urartian monarchs referred to themselves as beloved of Haldi, as if every conquest, every wall raised, every decree responded not only to human power, but to a celestial mandate. Urartu's hydraulic engineering is another of the most remarkable aspects of its culture. In a mountainous and arid region, they managed to design canals, dams, and aqueducts that defied the logic of their time. Many of these systems are still functional today, or at least their outlines still mark the terrain. Some structures were later used by the Persians, the Romans, even the Ottomans. as if the works of the Urartians had endured better than their own names. That an ancient civilization could design irrigation systems that are still studied today with awe should be enough to secure it a prominent place in human memory. And yet, it remains a ghost among giants. But perhaps the most unsettling thing about Urartu is its disappearance. It was not a direct conquest, nor a violent collapse precisely recorded. There are no texts that speak of the end. What happened was more of a slow dilution, a fog that fell over their history while other powers rose. By the 6th century before our era, there are no firm mentions of the kingdom. Its territory was progressively absorbed by the Medes and then by the Achaemenids. But there are no accounts of a great final war, nor of extermination. They simply stopped building, writing, expanding. Some cities were depopulated, others inhabited by new peoples. The Urartian identity dissolved, perhaps merged with other lineages, perhaps suffocated by the waves of empires that passed over them without taking the time to remember what they erased. There is something deeply symbolic in that ending. Urartu, a kingdom that strove to record its achievements in stone, that carved its existence in rock and metal, ended up being a lost voice among ruins. Its legacy was silently inherited by the Armenians, who incorporated part of its traditions, its architecture, and possibly even its language over the centuries. But Urartu as such vanished. There was no literary redemption, no epic song to seal its memory. Only stones, scattered inscriptions, and fragmentary archaeology. It was not until the 19th century that European researchers began to suspect the existence of this civilization. The cuneiform inscriptions that appeared in regions far from Assyria did not quite match. There was something different, another kind of power. Excavations in the 20th century confirmed what until then had only been scattered intuitions. That Urartu was an autonomous, advanced, and territorially extensive kingdom, whose history had been swallowed by the very land that saw it rise. Today, those who walk among the ruins of Erebuni, atop a hill overlooking the horizon of present-day Yerevan, do so among walls that have withstood more than 2,000 years. There, among basalt blocks and broken columns, one can still feel the echo of a civilization that looked to the sky with devotion, that carved its will into stone, and that built with the stubbornness of those who know that oblivion is the ultimate enemy. Urartu is not just a piece of the past we failed to preserve. It is a reminder that time, when not written down and not repeated, can swallow even the greatest. Among its fortresses and silences hides a warning. Not everything that disappears does so out of weakness. Sometimes history breaks because those who control it choose not to remember. And sometimes the most important civilizations are those that, even from the shadows, continue to speak through their ruins. The Black Trial of Oxford. There was a time when justice in Europe was not only applied with severity, but also with such boundless imagination that, from today's perspective, it borders on fable or delirium. Among the many stories buried beneath the dust of medieval judicial archives, one in particular has endured as an irresistible oddity. The Black Trial of Oxford, a legal proceeding from the 15th century that involved not men or women, but animals. Not as witnesses, nor as part of some ritual symbol, but as formal defendants, judged with all the ceremony and rigor of a human court. And although it may seem like a scene fit for satire, the truth is that it was real. The setting was the university city of Oxford, a center of thought and scholarship that already at the time housed some of the most educated minds on the continent. There, among cloisters and libraries, an unusual process unfolded. A trial against a group of animals accused of conspiracy, damage, and, according to some chronicles, witchcraft. What in another time might have been ignored or, at worst, resolved with simple violence, was instead cloaked in formalities. Charges were filed, a court was summoned, There was prosecution, defense, and even a verdict. And the accused were black. Black not because of their color, but because they were cats, goats, pigs, and other dark animals that had been captured on university property following a plague that had shaken the city. The testimonies, written in Latin and preserved with the cold precision of the legal records of the time, state that the animals had invaded sacred grounds, defiled books with their droppings, and damaged the walls of a chapel by rooting through the stones. They spoke of coordinated behaviors, disturbing gazes, and strange noises heard at night. All of this, it was said, could not be mere animal coincidence. It was an act of darkness. What fueled the paranoia was not so much the material damage, but the spiritual context of the time. Europe was immersed in an era in which the line between the religious and the judicial was thin. The Church's influence over judicial processes was not limited to cases of heresy or blasphemy. It extended to any behavior that could be interpreted as a sign of evil. And in a city like Oxford, where intellectualism coexisted with the most orthodox fervor, fear of the invisible had deep roots. It was believed that Satan could manifest through beasts, that animals were vehicles for the will of witches, or even that they could have intentions of their own, manipulated by forces beyond reason. The logic of the trial seemed to rest on the idea that these animals were not acting alone. They were not judged simply for destroying property, but for doing so as agents of something greater, something hidden. The term black accompanying the trial was not merely descriptive. It was a sign that what was at stake was the spiritual purity of the university environment. Darkness, in this context, was also a symbol, a feared allegory. In many European towns during the medieval and early modern periods, trials of animals were more common than one might imagine. Rats accused of eating crops, pigs that killed children, roosters executed for laying eggs. All of them faced justice as if they understood the charges. Lawyers were appointed, testimonies were heard, sentences were issued. But the Oxford case stood out for its scale, and for the fact that it took place in a location associated with knowledge and reason. There, in the halls where mathematics, philosophy, and theology were taught, a perfect performance of institutional fear was underway. The trial lasted several days. An improvised space was arranged to keep the accused confined. The most devout students attended the process as if it were a living lesson. Some even wrote about the intensity with which the animal's moral guilt was debated. Were they responsible for their actions? Could they be possessed? Should they be exorcised or punished as an example? The sentence was as absurd as its beginning. The animals were executed publicly, some drowned, others hanged, in an attempt to purge the city of any trace of dark influence. The macabre aspect of the matter lies not only in the fact that animals were killed without cause, but that it was done with the solemnity of a justice act. There was no laughter, no mockery. It was a serious ceremony, driven by deep convictions. In the heart of a city dedicated to thought, animals were sacrificed for metaphysical crimes that no one could prove, but that everyone feared. That contrast between rationality and superstition brutally defines the contradictory nature of the time. This trial also speaks to how power, whether religious, academic, or judicial, could transform the absurd into law. The logic of authority did not necessarily rely on evidence, but on the need to reaffirm order. If a group of animals could be seen as a symbolic threat, then punishing them reaffirmed the city's spiritual security. It was a ritual cleansing disguised as law. The documents that recount the trial were ignored for centuries or considered local oddities. It was not until the 19th century that some historians began to rescue these episodes as living testimonies of the medieval mind. Oxford was not the only place to witness such cases. In France, Switzerland, and parts of Italy, animals were treated as actors in the human drama, absorbed by a legal system that did not distinguish between the symbolic and the real. But the Black Trial of Oxford remains one of the most well-known, perhaps because of where it happened. It was not a rural village or a forgotten corner. It was the center of knowledge. And yet, even there, fear of the invisible reigned. Perhaps that is why this story is so unsettling, because it reveals that Enlightenment thinking is not always imposed by presence, but coexists for centuries with the shadows. Today, walking through the narrow streets of Oxford, among the Gothic towers and silent courtyards, may feel like a timeless experience. But beneath those stones, beneath those cloisters, where quantum physics and moral philosophy are taught, a court once gathered to condemn a group of cats and goats for having profaned the purity of wisdom. And in that image, grotesque and solemn at once, there is something that confronts us: the infinite capacity of the human being to give meaning to what it does not understand, even if in the process it loses sight of reason. Perhaps that trial was not just an act of superstition, but a metaphor for how societies face the unknown. And maybe, in the end, it was not a trial against animals, but against the very fears of an era that, like ours, struggled to name what it could not explain. The Children's Crusade. In the summer of the year 1212, Europe witnessed one of the most puzzling, moving, and tragic episodes of its medieval history. In a continent accustomed to holy wars and mass pilgrimages, no one expected the new movement to recover the Holy Land to rise from the thin voices and fragile bodies of thousands of children. The so-called Children's Crusade was not a crusade in the military sense we know, nor was it entirely organized by the Church, although its religious echo was profound. It was a strange, almost irrational display of innocent faith mixed with manipulation, hunger, and desperation. And it was, above all, a journey that ended in silence, without heroes or saints, wrapped in a fog of oblivion that only centuries later began to lift. There is no single account that tells the complete story, because the Children's Crusade was not a single march, nor did it have a sole leader. In reality, it was several simultaneous or consecutive movements that arose in different parts of Europe, especially in France and Germany, made up of crowds of children and youths who, inspired by a religious vision, decided it was their duty to free Jerusalem without weapons, trusting that their innocence would open the seas and touch the hearts of the unbelievers. What is most perplexing is that, according to chronicles, they carried no swords or shields, but wooden crosses hanging from their necks, pious chants on their lips, and the absolute conviction that they were doing the right thing. In France, a young shepherd named Etienne de Cloyes was at the center of one of these movements. He was about 12 years old and claimed to have received a letter from Christ, a direct message in which he was ordered to preach a children's crusade. The message was taken seriously, not only by uneducated peasants, but also by some local clergymen. It is said that hundreds, perhaps thousands of children began to follow him, marching from village to village, convinced that the miracle of the Red Sea would happen again if they reached the Mediterranean. The promise was that the sea would part before them, and they could walk to Jerusalem without a ship, without soldiers, only with faith. The strength of that image, the almost poetic power of children walking toward the sea in search of a divine promise, became legend even before the journey ended. Meanwhile, in Germany, another group began to organize, this time led by a boy named Nicholas. The German story was similar in spirit, though more ambitious in numbers. Some accounts speak of up to 20,000 children, although it is hard to know how many there truly were, because among them were also teenagers, beggars, young peasants, and some marginal adults who joined the group in search of food or purpose. The German route was more complex. They descended from the Rhineland toward the Alps, crossing mountains on foot, singing hymns and begging for bread, while villagers looked on with a mix of compassion and confusion. Some saw them as saints in the making, living martyrs. Others as an uncontrollable horde that would bring trouble. Along the way, many died. The heat, lack of food, diseases, poor terrain conditions, and the weakness of their age took a heavy toll. There was no organization, no planning, no strategy, only an obsessive idea, a directionless faith. Each village they passed through received them differently. Some fed them, others rejected them. In certain places, local authorities tried to stop the advance, seeing in that crowd a danger. But the flow was so unstructured, so scattered and fervent, that stopping them completely was impossible. Those who reached the Mediterranean, already greatly reduced by death and abandonment, found no miracle. The sea did not open. There was no heavenly apparition. There were no angels guiding them to the promised land. What they found was the harsh reality of a medieval world in which innocence was no guarantee of anything. Many were trapped in the ports, begging, waiting for a ship that never came. Some ended up returning, but most remained there, helpless, without resources or guidance. And this is where the story becomes even darker. According to several accounts collected later, some merchants offered to help. They promised ships to cross the sea, to take the children safely to the Holy Land. It was the chance to fulfill the promise. The little ones, exhausted and disillusioned, agreed. They boarded ships that, far from heading east, sailed to the coasts of North Africa, where they were sold as slaves. It is believed that many ended up in Egypt, in the markets of Alexandria, as servants, as property, as available bodies. What had begun as a march of hope became a trade disguised as a crusade. The cruelest part is that the merchants knew that no one would claim those children. They were not sons of nobles. They were landless peasants, without a surname, without a voice. The church did not react clearly to the events. There are no strong records of excommunications for the merchants involved, nor open condemnations of the event. Some ecclesiastical sectors even defended the march as a sign of purity, a sign that the message of Christ had touched the humblest hearts. But deep down, it was all a disaster. A collective drama that revealed the cracks in the religious thinking of the time, where faith could be pushed to the edge of madness, and where childhood was not protected, but used as a shield or banner. The children who survived were very few. Some returned with years of trauma, turned into adults before their time, carrying stories few wanted to hear. Others were lost forever, absorbed by foreign lands, by different cultures, by a slavery that continued in silence. And the most disturbing thing is that for centuries, this episode remained at the margins of history. It did not appear in the official accounts of the Crusades. It was not part of the glorious discourse of warrior faith. It was an uncomfortable mistake, a crack in the heroic narrative. Over time, the Children's Crusade became a myth, then was forgotten, and later recovered by historians who tried to understand its true scope. Some tried to deny its existence, saying it was all an exaggeration, a distortion of minor events. But the documents, the letters, the independent chronicles confirm that there were at least two major movements of young believers who walked toward nothingness. And although the exact details may vary, the core of the story is too consistent to be dismissed. Today, the Children's Crusade represents one of the most powerful symbols of how faith without guidance can lead to tragedy, of how hunger and hopelessness can dress as spirituality, and of how even the purest intentions can be manipulated by dark interests. But it is also a brutal mirror of a time that did not distinguish between age and obedience, between mysticism and exploitation. Because at some moment in that distant year, thousands of small feet walked dusty paths believing they would change the world. And what they found was the abyss. The Khazar Empire, the Jewish kingdom that vanished. There was a time, in the most unexpected corners of Eastern Europe, when a powerful empire rose among steppes, rivers, and trade routes connecting the northern Caucasus with the shores of the Caspian Sea. It was an empire that did not conform to the familiar forms of the West. nor did it mirror the Byzantine canons or the chronicles of Rome. It was a crossroads, a place where war and commerce converged, where nomadic tribes built palaces, and where caravans of silk and slaves stopped at wooden fortresses. That empire had a short, dry name that still sounds like a strange echo today: the Khazars. For centuries, the Khazars held a decisive position in the geopolitics of Eurasia. They emerged after the fragmentation of the Great Hunnic world and settled in the plains of the Volga and the Don, stretching from the Black Sea to the edges of Central Asia. At a time when Russia was merely a mosaic of scattered tribes and Kiev barely a dot on the map, the Khazars controlled trade between Europe and Asia. Their location gave them formidable strategic power. They controlled the Caucasus passes, navigable rivers, and the routes that carried gold and grain, silk and furs, wine and iron. Their empire had no defined walls, but it did have fortresses that stood like stone teeth to protect their interests. They were not only fierce horsemen, they were also clever administrators, quiet diplomats, and builders of a state that endured for more than 3 centuries in one of the most unstable regions of the known world. What makes the Khazar Empire especially fascinating is not only its political strength or its skill at remaining neutral between giants like Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate, but also its religious decision. In a gesture that baffled the medieval world, the Khazar leadership adopted Judaism as its official religion. It was a radical, unexpected change that still provokes debate among historians today. It was not a marginal or forced conversion. It was a calculated, strategic choice, but also a profound one. At a time when Christianity and Islam were competing for spiritual dominance in Eurasia, the Khazars chose a different path, one that kept them distant from the pressures of both powers and gave them a unique, strong, and distinct identity. The conversion is believed to have occurred around the 8th century, and although we do not possess internal documents from the kingdom that clearly confirm it, Arab, Byzantine, and Hebrew sources are surprisingly consistent. They tell that King Bulan, troubled by the religious differences among his people and surrounded by Christian, Muslim, and pagan communities, summoned a debate among representatives of the 3 great religions of the book. After listening to all of them and reflecting with his advisors, he decided to embrace Judaism, not as a mass imposition, but as a political and spiritual path that offered autonomy. In this way, Judaism became the religion of the court, the army, and the administrative elite. The common people, made up of a diversity of ethnicities and languages, continued with their own beliefs, but the heart of the empire beat from then on to the rhythm of the Torah. This transformation made the Khazar Empire a unique case. In a world where conversions were almost always forced, tied to conquests or crusades, here it was a deliberate, institutional decision. The Khazars did not aim to evangelize others or impose their faith by the sword. They lived surrounded by Christians to the west, Muslims to the south, pagans to the north. And they stood firm, building synagogues, importing sacred texts, adapting their law to Hebrew traditions. For generations, Judaism flourished in those steppe lands where winter lasted half a lifetime, and enemies could come from any direction. And yet, they endured. During all that time, the Khazars were essential in maintaining the balance of regional power. They were the wall that separated the Muslim Caliphate from the Slavic tribes of the north. When Islamic armies attempted to push beyond the Caucasus, it was the Khazars who faced and defeated them. They were also occasional allies of the Byzantines, circumstantial enemies, and trade partners. They knew when to negotiate and when to strike. They maintained a solid state structure, with a capital named Itil that rose over the Volga Delta, a vibrant, diverse city where Jewish merchants from Baghdad lived alongside Viking mercenaries and Persian scholars. Itil was a different kind of city. It had no dominant cathedrals or mosques. It was said to have houses of prayer for every religion, and that theological disputes were allowed as long as they did not threaten civil order. The government consisted of a ceremonial figure, the Khagan, and a functional king who managed daily affairs. It was a two-headed system, designed to prevent tyranny. The Khazar army, for its part, was feared and respected. It was composed of mounted archers, specialists in mobile combat, and also mercenary forces paid with caravan gold. They were nomads with administration, a contradiction that worked. But like all kingdoms that expand beyond their natural limits, the Khazar Empire began to weaken. Internal tensions, external pressures, and new trade routes that bypassed them all started to erode their foundation. The rise of the Rus, led by the Varangians in Kiev, changed the balance in the north. These new actors no longer wished to negotiate with the Khazars, but to replace them. Clashes, raids, and betrayals began. By the end of the 10th century, Prince Sviatoslav of Kiev defeated the Khazars in a series of devastating campaigns. Itil was destroyed. The border cities were ravaged. The Khazar system collapsed, and with it, their memory. After their fall, the Khazars left behind no grand literature, no monumental art, no mystical manuscripts to eternalize them. They left fragments, mentions in foreign texts, scattered archaeological remains, and a lingering question: what became of them? Some say they dissolved among the Turkic tribes of the east, others that their Jewish communities migrated westward, becoming part of the Ashkenazi Jewish populations of Central and Eastern Europe. That hypothesis, although controversial, has generated intense historical and even ideological debates in recent centuries. What is certain is that the Khazars vanished from the political map as a star fades at dawn, and their legacy lay buried beneath centuries of silence. Rarely in history has an entire kingdom with such a singular religious identity disappeared with so little trace. The Khazar Empire had no glorious chronicles to defend its memory. It had no native chroniclers to recount its feats, nor theologians to immortalize its faith. We depend on external sources, often laden with prejudice or misunderstanding. And perhaps that is why their story is so unsettling. Because they existed, they ruled, they influenced, and then they dissolved as if they had never been there. But the land remembers. On the edges of the Caspian Sea, in the plains of the Volga, in ruins that are still excavated with awe, there are signs of a civilization that chose a different path. The kingdom of the Khazars, that Jewish kingdom of the north, was more than an anomaly. It was a possibility, an alternative that for a time defied the logic of empires, and still today, it whispers its name from the dust. The Dancing Plague of 1518. During the sweltering summer of the year 1518, on the streets of Strasbourg, a city of the Holy Roman Empire located in what is now France, an event occurred that has defied medical logic, historical understanding, and the limits of sanity. It was not a war, nor a collective crime, nor a biblical punishment like those so often cited in interpretations of the past. It was something stranger, more bewildering. A woman stepped into the street in the middle of July and began to dance. With no music, no celebration, no pause. She danced for hours, then for days, and soon she was not alone. Within a few days, dozens of people had joined her, as if an invisible, unstoppable rhythm was pushing them from within. They did not dance with joy. They did not laugh. They did not celebrate. Their bodies convulsed compulsively, as though their will had been evicted from their bones. Chronicles from the time say that some danced until their feet bled, their legs buckled from exhaustion, and yet, in spite of the pain, they continued. Their eyes lost, their breathing ragged, their clothes soaked in sweat. They continued. Some died. They literally danced until they dropped, and still, the dance did not stop. What began with a single woman, named Trophaea, according to the most frequently cited records, became a kind of epidemic of uncontrollable movement. Within weeks, the number of dancers exceeded 100. The authorities, bewildered, did not know whether it was witchcraft, divine punishment, hysteria, or a physical disease. But instead of stopping the dance, they decided to facilitate it. In a logic that today might seem absurd, but that at the time was rooted in deeply held beliefs, the doctors of the city council concluded that the only way to heal was to let the impulse exhaust itself. So instead of intervening, they built stages, hired musicians, and cleared squares so the afflicted could continue dancing without obstacles. The result was devastating. The number of victims grew. Some collapsed from extreme exhaustion, others suffered heart attacks or strokes. The human body is not made to move without rest for days. No muscle can endure it, no mind can bear it. And yet, the bodies kept moving, shaken by a force no one could name. What is most disturbing is that there was no visible cause. It was not a demonic possession in the theatrical sense so beloved in the Middle Ages. There were no strange words, no exorcism cries, no ritual symbols, just bodies, dancing to death. Over time, and unable to contain the phenomenon, the authorities changed strategy. Performances were cancelled, music was banned from the streets, and the dancers were sent in procession to a chapel on the outskirts, dedicated to Saint Vitus, a martyr believed to hold power over nervous disorders. There they were given blessed shoes, prayers were offered, healing masses were held. Gradually the outbreak disappeared. The bodies calmed, the fever of movement ceased. But what remained was an unanswered question. Chroniclers documented the event, and though for centuries it was cited as just another oddity from a superstitious Europe, interest in this phenomenon has grown over time. They called it the dancing plague, though it was not a plague like the others. It was not spread by rats, it left no buboes, it caused no fever. It was something more intangible, a contagion of the soul, and therein lies its greatest mystery. For a long time, historians interpreted the event as a case of collective hysteria, an explanation that simplifies but does not solve the riddle. Why dance, and not scream or cry or flee? Why move until collapse, as if the body had become an instrument possessed by an inhuman rhythm? Some scholars have proposed environmental causes, such as the consumption of ergot, a hallucinogenic fungus that could contaminate bread and cause spasms, visions, and delirium. This theory has a scientific basis, but it does not explain the duration of the phenomenon, nor the coherence of the collective behavior. Not all the affected lived in the same houses, ate from the same harvest, or belonged to the same social group. Other approaches focus on the emotional and social environment. Strasbourg at that time lived under constant pressure. Years of famine, crushing taxes, religious tensions, and previous epidemics had created a climate of generalized anxiety. It was a society on the brink of collapse, where desperation was in the air. In that context, the body reacts however it can. And sometimes, the way to scream is not with words, but with muscles. The dance then may not have been a disease, but an escape. A collective way to express what could not be spoken. A social breakdown made flesh. The truth is that the dancing plague was not an isolated case. In previous centuries, similar outbreaks had already been documented in other European cities, in Aachen, in Metz, in Liège. In each, the circumstances were different, but the pattern was the same. People who, with no clear medical cause, began to dance uncontrollably. In some regions, the phenomenon was associated with the figure of Saint Vitus, which is why the disorder was known as Saint Vitus's dance for generations. It was not a disease in the modern sense, but a symptom of something deeper. Over the centuries, the memory of that summer faded. Modernity, with its classificatory obsession, tried to label the event with cold words: choreomania, mass psychosis, collective conversion disorder. But no label manages to capture the image of an entire city where no music played. But the bodies did not stop. A city that, not understanding what it witnessed, built stages to ease suffering. For therein lies the uniqueness of this story. In the way the authorities tried to solve the problem, not with punishments or exorcisms, but with drums and violins. Today, as one walks through the cobbled streets of Strasbourg, among half-timbered houses and quiet squares, it is hard to imagine that this ground was once the stage of a tragic choreography. No plaques remain, no monuments, no tributes. Only archives, letters, lost diaries, and some references in ecclesiastical chronicles. And yet, the memory persists. Because what happened there was not a fleeting madness, but a crack in logic. A reminder that the human body, when pushed to its limits, can find ways out that seem impossible. The dancing plague of 1518 remains one of the most disturbing stories in European history, not because of its death toll, nor because of its political impact, but because of its elusive nature. It was a phenomenon that cannot be fully explained, that fits no theory comfortably, and that has therefore become a kind of real-life legend. A documented event, yet unbelievable. A dance with no music, no purpose, no end, that turned a city into the stage of a tragedy choreographed by pain. A dance that, even today, continues to move in the margins of mystery. The year without sun, 536, and the beginning of collapse. In the year 536, something in the sky changed. It was not a war, nor a murdered king, nor a bloody invasion. It was the sun. The sun stopped shining as it should. A thick, gray, persistent veil covered the skies of Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, extinguishing the day and extending twilight for months. It was not a passing cloud, nor a dust storm. It was something else. A phenomenon that turned midday light into a warm shadow, that ruined crops, cooled the air, and left cities in a state of total bewilderment. Trees bloomed at the wrong time, snow fell in the middle of summer, and hunger began to appear like a ghost that would not leave for a long time. The Byzantine historian Procopius, a direct witness of that period, wrote that the sun shone weakly, like the moon, and that for a whole year it cast no shadows. His account was not poetic. It was literal. The light had changed. Something in the atmosphere, in the climate, or in the very heart of the sky had been altered. And that change would mark the beginning of one of the darkest periods in recent human history. Because it was not just a bad year. It was the start of a chain of misfortunes that, for more than a decade, dragged down empires, sickened entire peoples, froze the earth, and opened an abyss in the world's memory. For centuries, what happened in 536 was interpreted as an exaggeration, an ancient way of describing a harsh winter or a season of bad harvests. But the evidence gradually appeared where no one expected, in the trees. The growth rings of Scandinavian pines, carefully analyzed by modern scientists, showed an anomalous pattern of extremely reduced growth that year and in the following ones. Something had dramatically lowered temperatures, not for days nor weeks, but for entire years. The earth cooled, the climate changed abruptly, and humanity was not prepared. The exact causes remained hidden for a long time. However, more recent research has pointed to a colossal volcanic eruption, possibly in Iceland, as the main trigger of the event. The explosion launched enormous amounts of ash and sulfuric acid into the atmosphere, forming a stratospheric haze, a dense layer that partially blocked sunlight and disrupted the planet's thermal balance. The result was immediate and devastating. Abrupt temperature drops, massive crop failures, droughts in some areas, floods in others, and an atmospheric disorder that lasted, according to some studies, more than a decade. To this were added at least two other smaller volcanic eruptions in the years 545 and 547, which prolonged the crisis far beyond the initial impact. The effect was global, but the surviving testimonies come mostly from Europe and the Byzantine Empire. There, the permanent fog that covered the days was recorded in monastic chronicles, ecclesiastical letters, and historical texts. In China, imperial documents speak of snowfalls in the middle of summer, of entire harvests ruined, and of desperate migrations. In Ireland, medieval annals mention a lack of bread for several consecutive years. And in South America, archaeological records show that some pre-Inca cultures abruptly abandoned certain regions, perhaps due to the collapse of climate patterns. The human impact was profound. Cities, already fragile from political tensions, were overwhelmed. Famine spread like a disease. Trade halted. Coins stopped circulating. Livestock died in the fields with no one to bury them. Crops failed to reach maturity. Markets were left empty. And in the midst of that desperation, plagues began to appear. The deadliest arrived in the year 541, just 5 years after the Darkening, and became known as the Plague of Justinian. It spread from Egypt to Constantinople, and then to the rest of Europe, and it is estimated to have killed more than a third of the population of the Mediterranean. The collapse was not only climatic, it was social, economic, spiritual. It was, in many ways, an end of the world on a regional scale. The Byzantine Empire, which had reached its peak under the rule of Justinian, was never the same again. Its attempt to reconquer the former Western Roman Empire froze along with the fields. Money lost its value, the army was reduced, and monumental projects of architecture and law were halted. In the rural areas of Western Europe, many villages disappeared completely. There are no records of their names, no documents indicating why they were abandoned. They simply ceased to exist, as if the earth had decided to swallow what it could no longer feed. Beyond the numbers, the most striking thing about that event is how it was forgotten. It did not become myth nor legend. It inspired no epics nor great religious tales. Perhaps because it was too silent, too long, too desolate to be narrated. There were no heroes, no great battles, no redemptive gestures, only persistent cold, a gray sky, a formless fear. And that kind of tragedy, no matter how real it is, does not always find a place in collective memory. For a long time, history has been told through triumphs, through names that left monuments, through wars that changed borders. But there are chapters, like that of 536, that operate under a different logic. These are chapters where the protagonist is the climate, where nature imposes itself as brute force, and where human beings are not epic actors, but survivors. These episodes, because they are uncomfortable, because they do not fit easily into heroic narratives, are often left out. And yet, they are the ones that most clearly define the fragility of our species. Today we know that what happened in that year changed the course of history. It provoked massive migrations, altered the evolution of languages, accelerated the fall of cultures, and halted economic growth for over a century. Some historians consider it the most catastrophic event of the last millennium, and not because of what was seen, but because of what was no longer seen. The sun, hope, the future. Perhaps the reason why this event continues to fascinate those who study it is that it reminds us there are forces that understand neither politics nor religion. That no matter how tall the tower or how firm the law, everything can crumble when the earth trembles or the sky goes dark. 536 was a year without sun, a year when the world became shadow. And from that shadow, even today, we are still trying to understand what it means to live when the light disappears. The Rebellion of Hypatia. In a city where the desert dust blended with the marble of the columns and the murmur of knowledge still echoed through the walls, Hypatia walked among shadows already beginning to swallow the ancient world. It was Alexandria, in the final years of the 4th century, when libraries still guarded the memory of the wise, but free thought was beginning to pay too high a price. And there, among men who spoke of mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, taught a woman who refused to bow her head. Hypatia was more than a scientist, more than a philosopher or a teacher. She was a presence that unsettled because of her clarity, her independence, her mere existence in a space that religious power was already claiming as its own. She was the daughter of Theon, a renowned mathematician who had worked in the Library of Alexandria. From a young age, she learned geometry, logic, and the movements of the stars, and she soon surpassed her own father's fame. She taught at the museum, that center of studies that still preserved the echo of Plato's and Aristotle's school. Her students came from different parts of the Greco-Roman world, not only for her knowledge, but for her way of thinking, for her search for answers, unafraid of conflict. Hypatia did not offer dogmas. She offered uncomfortable questions, paths that did not always lead where the authorities wanted. And that, in the Christian Alexandria of the late 4th century, was starting to become a silent crime. The city she lived in was a boiling cauldron. Alexandria had been for centuries a jewel of the Hellenistic world, a crossroads between East and West, between science and religion, between word and sword. But in those years, the Roman Empire was already leaning toward Christianity as the dominant religion, and what had once been a mosaic of beliefs was becoming a spiritual battlefield. The old philosophical schools, the pagan temples, even the libraries began to be seen as threats to the new order. And amid that brutal transformation, Hypatia represented everything orthodoxy feared. A woman who did not keep silent, who did not serve the bishops, who taught without submission, who debated with men as an equal. She was not a rebel in the classical political sense. She did not lead armies or raise banners. Her rebellion was deeper, more dangerous. It was the rebellion of free thought. In fact, many of the most powerful men in Alexandria came to her for counsel. Among them, Orestes himself, the imperial governor of the city, who found himself trapped in an increasingly hostile dispute with Bishop Cyril. Orestes was a Christian, but he defended the autonomy of civil power against religious authority. Hypatia, although she did not openly take part in that struggle, became a symbol. To many, she was the one who influenced the governor's decisions, the one who kept Alexandria from bowing entirely to the church. Her figure then shifted from that of a respected teacher to that of an embodied threat. Tensions in the city became unbearable. Christianity, once persecuted for centuries, now persecuted others with equally fierce intensity. Pagan temples were destroyed, ancient statues shattered, texts deemed heretical burned without remorse. Radical groups known as the Parabolani patrolled the streets, not to care for the sick as their origin dictated, but to impose the bishop's morality with stones. In that context, Hypatia was not only a woman who taught science. She was a remnant of the ancient world, of a past many wanted to erase, and for that, she had to disappear. The crime was as brutal as it was symbolic. One afternoon, while returning home in her carriage, she was intercepted by an enraged mob. They dragged her out, took her to a church, and there, in an act of barbarity recorded in chronicles with a mix of horror and shame, they stripped her, beat her with sharp tiles, and tore her to pieces. Her remains were burned in a final act of denial. Killing her was not enough. Her body, her voice, her legacy had to be erased. But they did not succeed. Her death marked a turning point. For some, it was the symbol of fanaticism's triumph over reason. For others, the confirmation that there was no longer room for philosophy in a world now ruled by theology. The Neoplatonic schools of Alexandria began to close. Science, which had been born in that luminous city, entered a long darkness. It was not only about Hypatia. It was about the end of an era. The fall of the bridge between ancient knowledge and the medieval world already rising with its new rules. And yet, Hypatia did not entirely disappear. Her name, though absent from many official texts for centuries, survived in the margins. It was rescued by some Renaissance thinkers, revered by modern scientists, and turned into a symbol of resistance by movements that, centuries later, would again fight for free thought. The most impressive thing is that much of her work was lost. It is known that she wrote on geometry, algebra, astronomy, that she edited and corrected ancient treatises, but of her writings, only references remain. Words of others who mention her. Her diagrams, her arguments, her letters are gone. And still, her figure lives on. There is something deeply tragic in that absence. Hypatia was murdered for what she represented, not for what she had done. And that is what makes her a rebel without weapons, a martyr of thought, a flame lit in a time leaning into shadows. Her death was a warning. This is how those who do not submit end. But it was also a challenge. This is how those who do not surrender live. Remembering her story makes one understand that not all changes come through wars or conquests. Some arrive as imposed silences, as doors that close forever. Hypatia was one of those doors. After her fall, science ceased to be a shared pursuit and became a hidden whisper. But her echo did not fully fade. It still beats in places where knowledge is passionately defended, where the word is respected, where thought still holds value. And in every corner where a woman speaks out before power, in every room where science is taught without fear, Hypatia rises again. Even if they tried to erase her, even if her body burned, even if her name was hidden. Because there are voices that, even from the ashes, still teach me. The Great Oblivion, knowledge erased by official history. In the history of humankind, there is no silence more unsettling than the one that does not arise by chance, but from a deliberate choice. Not everything that was discovered, thought, built, or understood has reached us. There were civilizations that knew things we are only beginning to guess today. Men and women who wrote treatises, drew maps, designed instruments, and vanished as if they had never existed. It was not time that erased them. It was power, with its interests, dogmas, and needs. That oblivion, which seems accidental from a distance, becomes clear when one gets closer and understands that many historical gaps are not coincidences, but directed omissions, prunings of memory, surgical cuts in collective consciousness. Knowledge, no matter how pure it may seem, has always been tied to conflict. Knowing something has been, in many periods, a form of power. And whoever controls power decides what is remembered and what is buried. On the margins of official books, in incomplete manuscripts, in nameless ruins, ideas are hidden that were silenced for being too advanced, too uncomfortable, or simply alien to the dominant narrative. They were not mistakes, nor exaggerations. They were erasures. And their traces, though faint, still appear like scars on the chronologies we were taught. In ancient India, for instance, detailed surgical treatises were developed centuries before Europe even allowed the opening of a human body for medical purposes. The Sushruta Samhita, attributed to the sage Sushruta, describes complex surgical techniques, the use of precise instruments, and even tissue reconstruction. It speaks of cataract operations, cesareans, and skin transplants. However, this knowledge was relegated to the realm of the exotic, classified as Oriental curiosities for centuries, while Europe repeated the same medical errors over and over again. It was not until British colonization that these texts were discovered and seriously translated, though it was already too late. The world had moved on without them, believing everything had started in Greece. And it was not an isolated case. In China during the Han Dynasty, astronomers were already speaking of sunspots and the precession of the equinoxes. In the Islamic world, scientists like Al-Hazan, in the 11th century, already understood optics in an advanced way, while Europe was still debating whether light came out of the eye or entered it. The list of knowledge buried by disinterest, prejudice, or strategy is long. The Mesoamerican peoples, for example, calculated astronomical cycles with a precision that still amazes. But for a long time their calendars were considered superstitions instead of scientific tools. Their mathematical system, based on the use of zero as a conceptual value, preceded many cultures, but was dismissed for ideological reasons. There's also the case of Polynesian navigators, who, without compasses or maps, crossed thousands of kilometers of ocean guided by stars, currents, and bird behavior. For centuries, it was thought such migrations were impossible, that Oceania had been colonized by accident, in canoes dragged by luck. It was not understood, or was not wanted to be understood, that those peoples had developed a living cartography, inscribed in oral memory, which allowed them to navigate with a precision European maps could barely dream of. Official science did not believe them until their journeys were replicated in traditional vessels, using their techniques, and the world had to accept that they knew more than they had been credited for. Oblivion was not always provoked from the outside. Sometimes it was Western thought itself that destroyed what did not fit within its system. In the Middle Ages, hundreds of Greek texts were copied, translated, transmitted. But many others were ignored, considered pagan, or even destroyed for being contrary to the faith. The works that matched Christian theology were preserved, but treatises on matter, infinity, celestial bodies that contradicted the accepted Aristotelian view were lost. When the Library of Alexandria burned, once, twice, perhaps more, not only scrolls burned, possibilities burned. Ideas that will never again be thought as they were back then. In America, the arrival of the conquerors brought not only the sword and the cross, but also fire. The Mayan codices, hundreds of them, were reduced to ashes by Friar Diego de Landa, who believed he was erasing diabolical superstitions. In reality, he was destroying centuries of observation, writing, cosmology. Of the hundreds of codices, barely 3 have survived. What was lost there was not only history, it was science, language, worldview, and no one will be able to recover it. And so, one begins to understand that the history we learned is a version, not an exact reflection. That what is taught as a straight line, Egypt, Greece, Rome, modern Europe, is really a chosen path, not an inevitable one. The Great Oblivion was built over centuries, layer by layer, with censorship, with disdain, with arrogance. Sometimes it was about ignoring what came from other cultures. Sometimes it was the church. Other times, colonialism. But the constant has been that need to shape the past to justify the present. And although today we have more tools than ever to recover some of what was lost, not everything can return. There is knowledge that died with its authors, languages that stopped being spoken, symbols that no longer mean anything. We can excavate, translate, compare, but we will never fully know what was written in the burned codices, what was taught in the schools that were shut down, what that astronomer knew who died before sharing his theory with someone. That is the tragic dimension of the Great Oblivion, that it is final. But there is another way to look at this void, not as an absolute loss, but as a stimulus. Every fragment recovered, every ancient idea that resurfaces, is an opportunity to imagine what we were capable of thinking. It is a door that opens, an echo that persists. Because oblivion has its cracks. And through those cracks, history still breathes. When we speak of lost knowledge, we do not only speak of science and technology. We speak of worldviews, of ways of understanding life, time, death. We speak of wisdoms that do not fit in laboratories, but were part of complex, complete cultures. Today, while some defend a single view of the world, others seek to rescue those other ways of knowing, less quantifiable but just as valid. And in that rescue, the Great Oblivion begins to be less absolute. Because as long as there are those who ask what was lost, who dig in the margins, who give value to what is not in the manuals, Oblivion loses strength. And history, far from being a fixed line, becomes again what it always was, a battlefield for memory. Women erased from history. There is a gap in history that is not seen at first glance. It is a silent but enormous gap, where the names, voices, and deeds of thousands of women who lived, thought, invented, led, and created in all eras should be. Yet they disappeared from the official narrative as if they had been ghosts. It is not that they were not there. They were. What happened is that they were not wanted to be remembered. They were left out of books, statues, marble plaques, and chronicles. Some were replaced, others ridiculed, many simply ignored. It was not a casual forgetting. It was a repeated, almost structural decision to write history, as if the world had been built only by men. Women have been involved in medicine since the beginning, but instead of being recognized as healers, many were condemned as witches. In the Middle Ages, while male doctors still believed in imbalances of humors and bloodletting as universal methods, there were women who prepared remedies with plants, assisted childbirths, and understood how the body worked. Some did so through oral transmission, others through direct experience. They had real, useful knowledge. But when knowledge began to be institutionalized and universities became closed doors for them, their knowledge came to be seen as suspicious. It did not fit in the new science, not because it was useless, but because it came from female mouths. And this happened in many other areas as well. In philosophy, literature, astronomy, Hypatia was just one among many. In the medieval Islamic world, there were female poets, translators, mathematicians. In China, Africa, and pre-Hispanic America, women also thought, wrote, and led. But few made it into history books. Not because their contributions were smaller, but because the narrative was constructed with a filter that only allowed the masculine to pass through. Even when women managed to enter intellectual or scientific circles, many times they did so under pseudonyms, or working for others, or seeing their discoveries attributed to male colleagues. An emblematic case is that of Rosalind Franklin, whose photograph number 51 was key to discovering the structure of DNA. Her work, however, was used without her permission by Watson and Crick, who received the Nobel Prize, while she remained in the background, invisible. This is not an isolated case. It is a constant. Ada Lovelace, considered the first programmer in history, was for decades a footnote in the biographies of Charles Babbage, as if she had been an assistant, a minor figure, when in reality she was the one who understood that machines could do more than numerical calculations. And she wrote this in the 19th century. In the modern age, there were women who built astronomical instruments, mapped stars, and developed theories. Caroline Herschel, for example, discovered comets and helped her brother William create celestial catalogs, but for a long time she was presented only as his assistant. Mary Anning, in England, found fossils that revolutionized paleontology, yet she was ignored by scientific societies for being a woman, poor, and self-taught. Many used her findings. Few mentioned her name. The problem was not only exclusion, but also distortion. Many women were turned into decorative, romantic figures, when in reality they had been protagonists. Joan of Arc is an obvious example. A military leader, a strategist in her adolescence, who ended up becoming a saint but stripped of her political character. Female writers were seen as muses or sentimental ladies, even though they wrote with strength and independent thought. Female warriors were presented as anomalies, as if wielding a sword was incompatible with being a woman. They were celebrated, but always as exceptions, as if their greatness had been a mistake of fate. Sometimes the erasure was more direct. In the Renaissance, many female painters' works were signed by their husbands or masters. Artemisia Gentileschi had to fight to have her authorship recognized in a world of male-dominated workshops. Her paintings have a strength that transcends time, yet for centuries she was absent from the most important galleries. Something similar happened with female composers. Clara Schumann composed brilliant pieces, but always under the shadow of her husband Robert. Fanny Mendelssohn wrote music that was published under her brother Felix's name. Even in art, where creativity should be free, the male surname weighed more. In the 20th century, the situation began to change, but not so much by the will of institutions as by the effort of many women who refused to accept silence. In a world that still believed that the masculine was universal, they pushed doors, raised their voices, wrote their own stories, and in doing so, they forced others to look back, to review archives, to search for those names that were omitted. This is how many stories began to be recovered. Women astronomers at Harvard, forgotten writers of the Spanish Civil War, inventors who worked in hidden laboratories. Each discovery was a correction, a crack in the wall of official history. But recovering those names is not only an exercise of justice, it is also a way to better understand who we are. Because by leaving out half of humanity, history becomes lame, incomplete. We were taught that great revolutions, scientific advances, philosophical theories were born from male minds, in laboratories, on battlefields, in parliaments. But many times, those ideas also arose in kitchens, gardens, hospitals, in rooms where women thought, while caring for others, or while writing at night, when everyone else was asleep. Today, little by little, women are reclaiming the place that was always theirs, not as a concession, but as a right. They are returning to occupy the pages that were denied to them, not only in textbooks, but in the memory of those who build the present. The path is still long. There are still many stories to uncover, many names to rescue, but there is no turning back now. Because once you see the gap, you can no longer pretend it is not there. The women erased from history were not invisible. They were made invisible. And now, word by word, line by line, they are coming back. Because history is not a closed narrative. It is a territory in dispute, and they have returned to claim it. The Albigensian Crusade and the extermination of Cathar knowledge. At the beginning of the 13th century, in the green valleys and gentle hills of southern France, a culture flourished that seemed to have found a rare balance between spirituality, art, music, and free thought. It was the land of troubadours, of small but refined castles, of courtly love, and of a language, Occitan, that sweetly sang the nuances of the human soul. But it was also the home of a religious current that the Church of Rome would never tolerate. The Cathars, also called Albigensians, a community that offered another way to understand Christianity, less hierarchical, less oppressive, more inward. A religion that threatened the absolute dominance of orthodoxy, not by force, but by the coherence of its message. The Cathars believed in the existence of two principles, one divine, pure, spiritual, and the other corrupt, material, worldly. For them, the world as we knew it was a mistake, a trap of evil. The body was a prison, the flesh a distraction, and redemption was not found in empty rituals, but in radical detachment, in an austere life that sought inner purity. They did not recognize the authority of the Pope, nor accept traditional sacraments, and refused to swear allegiance to any earthly power. They practiced the consolamentum, a spiritual rite that replaced baptism and marked the beginning of a life wholly devoted to good. They had men and women who preached, who led communities, who lived as equals. They were, in many ways, a moral threat to a church that had become rich, powerful, and authoritarian. In Toulouse, in Albi, in Carcassonne, in Béziers, the Cathars were not a marginal sect. They were part of the landscape. They did not live in catacombs or in secret. They were active members of a society that respected them, even among local lords who defended them more out of conviction than convenience. And that was exactly what alarmed the papacy. It was not just heresy. It was an organized, articulated heresy, supported by a network of castles, safe paths, and ties with the nobility. A parallel church that did not need golden temples or armed armies. What it offered was meaning. Then came the Crusade. In 1209, Pope Innocent III, after years of failed diplomatic attempts, called for a military campaign against the Cathars, an internal European crusade that was meant to eradicate heresy from its roots. What unfolded then was a war of extermination disguised as religious purification. Thousands of knights from northern France, incentivized by promises of land, forgiveness of sins, and easy loot, marched south with swords raised and souls committed to a cause they did not fully understand. They were going to fight Christians who did not recognize the Pope's authority, but who lived with an intense, sincere, radical faith. The first great act of violence was the assault on Béziers. The city, which housed both Catholics and Cathars, refused to hand over the heretics. In response, the Crusaders razed the entire city. They killed everyone: men, women, children. They made no distinction. When someone asked the papal legate how to recognize the Cathars among the crowd, his answer was forever recorded as a symbol of the most blind fanaticism. Kill them all. God will recognize his own. Whether true or not, that phrase was the perfect summary of what was to come. Because the Albigensian Crusade was not a war of clean battles, it was a campaign of terror. For years, Languedoc was turned into a field of massacres. Carcassonne fell. Toulouse resisted until exhausted. The castles were taken one by one. The perfects, as the Cathar leaders were called, were burned alive, publicly, as an example. Those who converted were humiliated, forced to walk barefoot, wear distinctive clothes, carry stones. The aim was not only to destroy belief, but also dignity. The inquisitors arrived with books, methods, lists. Every suspect was interrogated for hours. Informants were rewarded. Doubt was punished. What had once been a refuge of alternative thought became a desert of fear. The most tragic part was not only the destruction of lives, but the systematic erasure of a different knowledge. Because the Cathars were not mere dissidents, they were thinkers. Their vision of the soul, of evil, of human destiny, had deep philosophical roots. Some modern currents have compared their ideas to Manichaeism, others to ancient Gnosticism. But they were original in their way of living. They did not accumulate wealth, did not eat meat, did not lie, did not fight. Their wisdom lay in consistency with their principles, in a spirituality that confronted corruption without violence. And that knowledge, which was not written in treatises but transmitted by word and example, disappeared with them. Because when the crusade ended, Cathar heresy had been completely annihilated. The last pockets of resistance took refuge in Montségur, a castle on top of a mountain that became the final symbol of the struggle. There, for months, men and women resisted the siege. They were not warriors, but they resisted as if they were. When they finally fell, they were offered to renounce their faith. None accepted. More than 200 were burned in a huge bonfire at the foot of the castle. They left no screams, no pleas. They came down singing. It was their last act of rebellion. Then, silence. With the fall of Montségur ended more than just a heresy. It ended a different way of understanding Christianity. And with its songs, symbols, ways of life, oral teachings were erased. The Occitan language was gradually replaced by Northern French. The Inquisition was permanently established, and the South, which had been diverse, open, complex, became homogeneous, controlled, watched. The price of that unity was the loss of a spiritual and cultural richness that never returned. Long after, the remains of the Cathar tradition were rescued by scholars, seekers of meaning, curious readers who read between the lines and understood that the crusade was not just an act of faith. It was also a political, territorial war, an excuse to dominate a region that had grown too free. The Church won, but in doing so, left a hole in history, a hole that still hurts today. The Cathar extermination is not just a medieval episode. It is a mirror. It shows us how fear of different thought can turn into fire, how ideas that challenge power, even if they wield no swords, can be considered dangerous, and how an entire culture can be erased, leaving almost no trace, except in ruins, broken songs, in names that still resist in the stones. Today, when one climbs Montségur and looks at the landscape from that height, the wind blows with a strange force. There are no large monuments, no golden altars, only remnants of walls and a silence that seems to say more than all the books. There, where the Cathars gave their last word, one can feel that knowledge, even if it is burned, always leaves a spark lit. And sometimes, all it takes is for someone to remember it for it to burn again. The Guanches of the Canary Islands. In the middle of the Atlantic, between Africa and Europe, the Canary Islands rise like fragments of a continent that never was, as if the earth had decided to leave loose clues in the middle of the ocean. There, in those volcanic, rugged territories, surrounded by a sea that sometimes caresses and sometimes devours, lived for centuries a people who seemed to have been left outside of time. A people who, when the Europeans arrived with their square sails and hunger for conquest, still lived as if the ancient world had not ended, as if the tides of history had not reached them. They were the Guanches, tall, robust, with fair skin in some cases, with their own culture, their gods, their rituals, their language, and a way of life that puzzled the Castilian chroniclers. No one understood why they lived there, in the middle of nowhere, isolated from the world, living in caves, mummifying their dead, singing stories on the edge of cliffs. When the Europeans set foot on the islands, they expected to find virgin land, perhaps savage tribes or some Arab vestige, but what they saw was something else. They found a structured society, with chiefs called menses, with rules of coexistence, with complex funeral customs, with shepherds who knew every inch of the island, and a whistling system that allowed communication from mountain to mountain without the need for spoken words. It was a world without metal weapons, that did not know the wheel, but deeply understood its environment. It was archaic in tools, but sophisticated in relation to nature. And that, for those coming from a continent that had already chained its soul to iron and gold, was uncomfortable. For a long time, no one knew where they had come from. The Guanches spoke a language that did not resemble Castilian, nor Arabic, nor Portuguese. Their faces were not black, but neither were they fully European. Some ancient chroniclers, puzzled by their appearance and isolation, began to formulate theories bordering on myth. Some linked them to the Atlanteans. Others said they were descendants of Nordic peoples lost in an impossible migration. But the most accurate clue came from words. Their language had similarities with those spoken by the Berbers of North Africa. And with that clue, an idea emerged that most experts accept today. The Guanches were probably the result of ancient migrations from the African coast, more than 2,000 years ago, carried out at a time when the wind and currents could drag rudimentary boats westward with no hope of return. It was those forgotten sailors who planted a civilization on islands where iron did not exist, where tools were made of stone, bone, and wood, and where every resource was used with almost religious respect. They learned to live with just enough, to raise goats, to store rainwater, to drill into rock to make a home. And although they did not build great temples nor leave written books, they developed a strong oral culture, with stories passed from grandparents to grandchildren as if they were invisible treasures. These were stories about the sun, the stars, the cycles of the grass, the ancestors who continued watching from the sky. One of the most enigmatic elements of Guanche culture was their way of dealing with death. Unlike many European societies of their time, the Guanches mummified their dead. With techniques that still amaze today, they wrapped bodies in goatskins, dried them in the sun, used plant resins, buried their loved ones in sacred caves, often difficult to access, as if they wanted to hide the soul of the deceased from the noise of the world. This was not a simple ritual. It was a vision of life that placed ancestors as a present part of the world. It was not an end. It was a way of remaining. And that indicated a level of reflection that completely denied the image of primitives that many later tried to impose on them. But as has often happened in history, the encounter with the other turned into conquest. In the 15th century, when the European kingdoms competed for new lands and routes to the south, Castile set its sights on the Canary Islands. What followed was a long, uneven, and bloody war. The Guanches resisted. Some island kingdoms made pacts, others were destroyed. The conquest of Tenerife, the last to fall, was especially brutal. The Menchayato of Taoro, under the leadership of Bencomo, offered fierce resistance, using the mountainous terrain, ambushes, and a bravery that puzzled the Castilians. But in the end, iron defeated stone, the horse defeated the foot, and the cross prevailed over the shepherd's staff. After the conquest, the real forgetting began. The Guanche language was banned. Rituals were destroyed, tombs Christianized, survivors sold as slaves. The culture was forcibly diluted, absorbed by a system that admitted no nuances. The names of the gods disappeared. The songs stopped being sung. The mummies were stolen and sent to distant museums where they were seen as curious objects, stripped of soul. What remained, as the last witness, were the mountains, the ravines, some words mixed in popular speech, and bones hidden in caves that no one dared fully to profane. For centuries, the Guanches were seen as a footnote in Spanish history. They were not protagonists, barely an anecdote. Archaeology was slow to regard them with respect. History reconstructed them from fragments, a vessel, a skeleton, a written testimony by a conqueror. And yet, they endured. Not as an empire or monument, but in the collective memory of the islanders, in the words that still survive in place names, in the echo of the Gomero whistling language still taught as art and heritage. Today, speaking of the Guanches is speaking of a people who were ripped from their world, but who did not disappear entirely. Their incomplete history, their partially rescued culture, their voice still veiled by centuries of silence, reminds us that not all peoples who did not write books ceased to exist. Some left their mark on the land, on the mountains, in the way the wind blows through the ravines. And that mark, though faint, can still be followed. The Guanches were neither Atlanteans nor ghosts. They were humans. Humans with a deep culture, with a way of life adapted to the limit, with a wisdom that did not shine in courts, but sustained life day after day. They were erased, yes, but not completely. Because as long as there are those who name them, who wonder what they dreamed, what they sang, what they loved, they will remain alive in some corner of the islands. and perhaps that resisting oblivion is the purest way to endure. The Republic of Cospaia, the country that should not exist. Among the Apennines, between lands that have changed hands, languages, and flags for centuries, there was a tiny strip of land where time seemed to stand still, where the rules of great empires did not apply, where authority did not rise from a throne nor impose itself from a church, but simply did not exist. That piece of land was called Cospaia, a village hidden in what is today the Italian region of Umbria, and for nearly 4 centuries it lived as an independent republic, without an army, without written laws, without prisons, without taxes, and without any flag other than a word embroidered on fabric. Perpetua et firma libertas, perpetual and firm freedom. What is surprising is not that it existed. What is astonishing is that it survived for so long without anyone seriously claiming it, like a secret no one wanted to correct. The story of Cospaia begins in 1441, and like many strange episodes in history, it was born from a mistake. At that time, the Papal States, territories governed directly by the Pope, were defining their boundaries with the Republic of Florence. Both powers agreed to divide their domains by a natural line, the course of the river flowing down from the mountains. But they made a small, fatal, and charming oversight. The map they signed used the name of a river that was not the correct one. There were 2 watercourses, one main and one tributary, and between them lay a small strip of land not mentioned in the treaty, a nobody's land, without legal owner, simply omitted by both parties. There, in that diplomatic gap, lived a small farming village that suddenly discovered it answered to no lord. They were not subjects of the Pope, nor were they Florentine citizens. They were by accident free. And the most curious thing is that they decided to stay that way. Instead of asking for protection, begging to belong to someone, the inhabitants of Cospaia raised their heads and said, "Here, we rule." It was a modest peasant community with no imperial aspirations or army, but they knew what it meant not to have to pay taxes, not to be subject to conscription, not to obey judges coming from elsewhere. They were alone, and that solitude made them unique, a republic without a state, without bureaucracy, without any law other than the verbal agreement of those living there. For centuries, Cospaia was a parenthesis on the map of Europe, a place where central power did not reach, where peasants cultivated their lands without paying tribute, where no one meddled in another's life unless necessary. They had no army, but no enemies either. No one invaded them because no one thought it was worth it. They were too small, too poor, too organized in their chaos. They had no prisons either, because they did not need them. If someone committed a crime, and it did not happen often, the punishment was communal, direct, without formal trial. Reputation was worth more than any written law. What brought prosperity to Cospaia, beyond its accidental independence, was a plant. In the mid-16th century, tobacco arrived in Europe from America, and shortly after, the inhabitants of Cospaia began cultivating it on their fertile lands. But while in the neighboring states its trade was regulated, taxed, and monitored by authorities, in Cospaia there was no prohibition. They could plant it, dry it, sell it, without control or taxes. It became their economic engine, their hallmark. From there, leaves were sent to Florence, Rome, Naples, in discreet packages crossing the border with no one able to do anything. The peasants of Cospaia became experts in its cultivation. They even developed their own varieties, drying houses, artisanal techniques that today would be cultural heritage if they had been preserved with care. Over the centuries, Cospaia maintained its independence without scandals. It did not seek to expand, had no diplomacy, sent no ambassadors. It was an anomaly that threatened no one. That is why it survived. The great powers around it, occupied with wars, crises, and treaties, simply ignored it. It was easier to let it continue existing than to face the paradox of a republic without structure. Some knew of its existence, but regarded it as a quaint curiosity. No one thought a group of smoking peasants could mean anything more. And yet, in that invisibility, in that proud simplicity, Cospaia represented something profound. It was a silent mockery of power, a demonstration that life can be organized without castles, without armies, without courts, without decrees. It was a small thorn in the pride of the modern states, an uncomfortable proof that freedom, when nurtured from below, can be kept alive for centuries. They did not need to write constitutions or build parliaments. Their system of government was custom, the given word, mutual respect. It was fragile, yes, but it was also strong because it depended on no one else. Finally, in 1826, the times caught up with Cospaia. The pressures of the new political order, the reorganization of the Italian territory, and the demands of a Europe that no longer tolerated administrative voids led to its definitive annexation. It was a peaceful, agreed, almost symbolic absorption. Some inhabitants signed the end of independence with resignation, others with relief. They were granted small privileges as compensation for the loss, but what was extinguished was more than a legal status. It was a way of being in the world, the last free republic born from a mistake. Today, in Cospaia, there remains only a modest sign that recalls its history, a sign that seems to apologize for not being bigger. The village is quiet, silent, like so many others in Italy. But those who know how to look can find traces of that past. In the way neighbors greet each other, in the old fields where tobacco was once grown without permission, in the stories still told at dusk, when the sun falls over the rooftops and memory stretches long. Because although the world has changed and borders are now drawn too precisely, there is something in Cospaia that resists. The idea that freedom, even if born by accident, can be sustained if there is will. The story of Cospaia is small, but not insignificant. It is proof that history is not made only of wars or empires. There are also margins, cracks, fissures through which the unexpected slips in. And in those cracks, sometimes, something beautiful grows. Cospaia was an anomaly, yes, but it was also a beacon, one that shone silently for nearly 400 years. And that, in a world that changes every day, is a feat worthy of being remembered. The Piri Reis Map. In the year 1513, when the world had not yet fully accepted that there was another world beyond the Atlantic Ocean, an Ottoman admiral, navigator, cartographer, and scholar named Piri Reis drew a map that, centuries later, would turn scholars, historians, and dreamers upside down. What he outlined was not just a representation of the known world, but a compendium of mysteries, lines that should not have been there, coasts that did not match the era in which they lived. It was a map of fragments, made from other lost maps, sewn together with ancient references and knowledge that seemed to come from some library sunken beneath the waves. And on that piece of gazelle skin that still survives, there is not only geography, there are suspended questions, echoes of knowledge older than written history. The Piri Reis Map is a partial document, just a portion of what was once a larger nautical chart. It is kept in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, and for centuries it lay quietly on the shelves of oblivion. It was rediscovered in the 20th century, when some scholars realized it was no ordinary item. What that portion of the map showed, with colorful strokes, Ottoman annotations, and nautical details, included, with surprising accuracy, parts of Western Europe, the coast of Africa, and much of South America, at a time when America was still being outlined by Caravel. And that alone was remarkable. But what really puzzled everyone was what appeared in the south. There, stretching like a white shadow, appeared a landmass that seemed to correspond to Antarctica. Not as we know it now, covered by a permanent ice sheet, but with detailed coastlines, bay inlets, geographical features that cannot be seen from the air or sea, but from deep measurements, as if it had been mapped before the continent froze. And here the mystery begins. Because Antarctica was not officially discovered until the 19th century, and its shape beneath the ice could not be known precisely until ground-penetrating radar arrived in the 20th century. So how could it be there, drawn on a Renaissance map by an Ottoman admiral? Piri Reis did not hide his sources. In his notes, he mentions that he used about 20 earlier maps, some Portuguese, others Arab, and some even older, from the times of Alexander the Great, according to his words. He did not draw the world from scratch. He reconstructed it. And that is precisely what makes his work so valuable. It was a synthesis. He took documents that were already old in his time, combined them with information gathered by Turkish, Spanish, and Arab sailors, and built a vision of the world that mixed the known, the guessed, and what no one expected to find. The question that lingers, that always lingers, is where those original maps came from. Some scholars argue they could have been Greek documents, perhaps based on the work of Eratosthenes, Hipparchus, or even some lost cartographic school. Others venture that the maps might come from even older civilizations that knew of the White Continent when it was not yet hidden by ice. This theory is, of course, controversial. The traditional scientific community has rejected or downplayed it, attributing the shape of Antarctica on the map to scale errors, the cartographer's imagination, or confusion with other coasts like those of southern South America. But there are details hard to ignore. One of the most discussed aspects is the similarity between the outline of the supposed Antarctic continent on the Piri Reis map and the actual coasts of Queen Maud Land, a region of eastern Antarctica. This coincidence, which can only be confirmed by comparing the map with modern satellite images, has led some to think that in the past there was a civilization, or a network of knowledge, that knew more than is usually credited. Because if the maps Piri Reis used had those outlines, who made them? When? How? The mystery deepens when considering Piri Reis's own context. He was not a newcomer, nor an adventurer. He was a military man, a naval strategist of the Ottoman Empire, deeply cultured, with access to first-rate sources. His navigation book, the Kitab al-Bahriye, is a monumental work, rich in detailed descriptions of coasts, winds, currents, with practical advice for sailors and geographical observations that demonstrate a real mastery of the nautical art. He was not someone who improvised. He was precise. And if he decided to include that land shape on his map, it was not out of fantasy, but because he trusted what those ancient maps showed. The fragment we have today of his map, because the rest is lost, has been subject to all kinds of interpretations. Some see it as proof of knowledge predating the Renaissance, of a humanity that perhaps knew more before than it would after. Others have linked it to more daring theories, to the idea of lost civilizations, to fragmentary memories of sunken worlds. And although some of these hypotheses border on the mythical, the fact remains that the map is there, with its lines, with its names, with its silence, challenging dates, dogmas, and certainties. Perhaps the explanation is simpler. Perhaps what it shows is not Antarctica, and it is all a set of projection errors, misinterpreted copies, disordered inheritances. But even so, even if there is no geographical mystery, there is a deeper mystery, the network of knowledge transmission. How did those fragments of the world reach the hands of an Ottoman admiral? What paths did the maps, ideas, and coordinates follow? Whose hands copied them, adapted them, hid them? How many others were lost in fires, wars, abandoned monasteries? The Piri Reis map is not just a geographic document. It is a metaphor for hidden knowledge, for remnants of past wisdom that survive as loose pieces, suddenly appearing in forgotten libraries or in maps no one expected to find. It reminds us that the history of knowledge has not been a straight line, but a chain of forgettings, rediscoveries, pieces that never quite fit, that there are things that were known and then forgotten, things that were intuited and then buried, and that sometimes the past speaks to us through a parchment with faded ink, saying, "The world is older than you think, and what you know is only a part." Maybe that is why the map remains fascinating, because there is something in that piece of gazelle skin with its hand-drawn lines that challenges the arrogance of our present, something that forces us to look back with humility, recognizing that not everything is said, that not everything is discovered, and that the sea, that ancient sea drawn by Piri Reis, still holds secrets waiting, silently, to be found. Roman dodecahedrons, artifacts without explanation, buried beneath centuries of earth, forgotten by classical books, absent from the lists of the empire's glories. There are objects that survive time without offering answers. One of them, perhaps the most intriguing, is the Roman dodecahedron, a piece that appears again and again in archaeological sites across northern Europe. Always similar, always different, always baffling. Small, hollow, with 12 pentagonal faces and a sphere at each vertex. This artifact has puzzled historians, archaeologists, mathematicians, and curious minds for centuries. Because there is no inscription, no literary mention, no image in mosaics or frescoes explaining its function. It is a silent object, from a civilization that left it unexplained. Since the 18th century, when the first specimens began to be found, more than 120 dodecahedrons have been unearthed in various regions of the ancient Roman world. Gaul, Germania, Belgium, parts of Great Britain, always under the same conditions, about the same size, made of bronze or similar alloys, with circular holes on each face, each of a different size, and small spherical protuberances on the vertices. Some are so small they fit in the palm of the hand. Others, heavier, could be used as weapons, but none show signs of wear. None seem to have been used practically. Yet they were carefully crafted. What is most intriguing is not that the object is rare. It is that it does not appear in any written source. The Roman Empire was obsessively detailed in its documentation. It left treatises on architecture, military manuals, cooking recipes, astronomy studies, tool descriptions, tax lists, agricultural calendars. And yet, no one mentions these objects. Neither Pliny, nor Vitruvius, nor the late antique encyclopedists. The dodecahedron does not exist in the language of its time, and that makes it an out-of-place artifact within a civilization that recorded everything. Theories about its use have piled up like layers of an onion without a center. Some suggest it was an astronomical tool, a kind of instrument to calculate solstices or equinoxes, based on the light passing through its holes and the angles formed by its faces. Others see it as a diameter gauge, a kind of caliper for tubes, ropes, or even projectiles. Some associate it with religious rituals, divination, magical practices, or even luxury toys for the children of wealthy families. The lack of consensus has only fueled its legend. In recent times, some enthusiasts have tried to reproduce them with 3D printers, testing combinations of sunlight, rods, water, fire, looking for patterns. The results are interesting, but inconclusive. Even if some dodecahedrons seem to align light in a specific way on certain calendar dates, that does not prove this was their original function. Most have been found in rural contexts, near agricultural villas, which leads to thinking their use was not necessarily sophisticated or scientific. But they were not purely decorative either. Their design is too specific to be accidental. Another theory proposes they could have been instruments for knitting gloves. This idea, based on the possibility of using the holes to hold thread tension when braiding wool, makes some sense considering many pieces were found in cold regions where glove use was common. However, this explanation falters when analyzing the variety of sizes and the delicacy of some specimens, which do not seem to have been used for everyday manual work. And we return to the starting point. Some, driven by desperation or the desire for mystery, have taken it a step further. They have suggested that dodecahedrons could be fragments of older knowledge, inherited perhaps from cultures preceding Rome, absorbed without fully understanding their original function. This idea, although difficult to support academically, fits a known pattern. That of civilizations incorporating elements whose origin is lost over time, keeping them as ritual or symbolic objects even when their practical purpose is gone. There is something deeply human in that possibility, because not everything that is preserved is functional. Sometimes objects survive because they evoke, because they represent something that cannot be explained, but that feels important. Perhaps the dodecahedrons were that. Talismans, bronze amulets, artifacts charged with a meaning that has slipped away from us. In cultures where religion, astronomy, and daily life intertwined indistinguishably, an object could be many things at once: a tool, a guide, a symbol, and in that ambiguity, perhaps, lies their silence. The truth is that none have been found in Rome, the heart of the empire. They all appear on its borders, in zones considered peripheral, where the influence of other cultures still pulsed. Were they then local products, created on the margins, used by peoples under Roman rule but not fully Romanized? Or were they part of a passing fashion, a regional custom that did not spread to the rest of the empire? In either case, what is clear is that they were not common, not mass-produced, and their meaning was not important enough for anyone to bother explaining it in writing. The mystery of the Roman dodecahedron forces us to remember that history is not complete. That for every preserved column, every legible inscription, every name that appears in school manuals, there are 1,000 gaps, 1,000 nameless objects without clear function or context. Archaeology works with fragments, and sometimes those fragments look at us more strongly than monuments. They tell us that we do not know everything, that there were parallel cultures, ways of thinking, ways of living, that left no books or speeches, but that existed and continue speaking to us from their silence. Perhaps the greatest value of the dodecahedron is not in its shape, nor in its possible use, but in what it awakens. In the certainty that the past is broader than its records, in the feeling that there are knowledges lost without a trace, not because they were inferior, but because they did not fit within the margins of the official. Each of these objects, with their perfect geometry and lack of explanation, is an open wound in memory, a reminder that knowledge is not always transmitted, and that the unexplainable also deserves a place in history. Maybe someday its exact function will be discovered, and the mystery resolved. Or maybe not. Perhaps they will remain what they are now: voiceless artifacts, orphaned pieces of a puzzle that no longer has an edge. And maybe that is not wrong, because in a world obsessed with answers, sometimes the most valuable thing is a good question left unresolved. And the Roman dodecahedrons, those small polyhedrons that traveled silently through the centuries, are exactly that: a question, round, hollow, perfect. The Stones of Ica. Sometimes the past appears disguised as a mystery. It does not knock on the door, it does not announce itself, it does not come wrapped in scrolls or ceremonial ruins. Sometimes it shows up on the ground, covered in dust, and when someone picks it up, the whole world scratches its head, unsure whether it is facing a true clue or a very well-crafted lie. This is what happened in Ica, a dry corner of Peru where the earth seems to hide more than it reveals. There, on the edges of the desert, stones began to appear. Hundreds of stones, then thousands, carved with drawings that seemed impossible. Dinosaurs, heart surgeries, maps of vanished continents, humans riding reptiles, tools that should not exist in any ancient civilization. They were polished black stones, the size of a book or a hand, engraved with firm lines, as if the person who made them knew exactly what they were telling. Thus was born the mystery of the Stones of Ica. It all started in the mid-20th century, when some local farmers began selling these stones to tourists, amateur archaeologists, and collectors. They brought them from nearby rivers or unearthed them at shallow depths. There were many, more than anyone could imagine, and most shared the same engraved style. Human figures interacting with extinct animals, detailed surgical scenes, telescopes, anachronistic technologies. It looked like an impossible museum, a kind of chronicle of a civilization never recognized by official history. And in the midst of this whirlwind of theories, one name appeared that set the course for everything: Javier Cabrera d'Arquea. Cabrera was a doctor, surgeon, man of science, and a native of Ica. At some point, he received one of these stones as a gift. At first, he did not pay much attention, but something about that carved figure, a strange fish with prehistoric shapes, made him look closer. He began to investigate, buy more stones, collect testimonies, connect dots. In a short time, his house became an improvised museum, filled with shelves holding thousands of engraved stones, each with a different scene, as if they were pages of a giant book. Cabrera, convinced that he had in his hands the evidence of a civilization earlier than anything known, devoted the rest of his life to studying and defending these stones. His theory was provocative. According to him, the stones were the work of a prehistoric culture with scientific knowledge so advanced that it had coexisted with dinosaurs, performed brain surgery, understood astronomy with millimetric precision, and mastered technologies that only began to develop in the 20th century. He did not talk about extraterrestrials. He spoke of humans, ancient, brilliant, forgotten, a civilization that had destroyed itself or had been wiped out by a global cataclysm. Cabrera published books, gave lectures, granted interviews. His museum was visited by thousands of people, and, as expected, his proposal divided the world. For many, Cabrera's findings were a fraud, a fantasy supported by the need to believe in something extraordinary. Peruvian researchers, archaeologists, and anthropologists pointed out that the local farmers manufactured the stones using rudimentary techniques and modern tools, and that they had created a small artisanal business based on the demand for mysterious objects. Some even confessed on camera to having carved the stones on commission. They said they did it because tourists paid well, because the myth was growing, and because there were buyers willing to believe anything that seemed to come from an impossible past. However, others were not convinced. They argued that while many stones could be forgeries, some showed wear and patina indicating considerable age. Not all could have been made in the 20th century. Certain stones had been found before the phenomenon became known, which disproved the idea of purely commercial fabrication. Moreover, some engravings had a level of detail and internal coherence difficult to attribute to untrained farmers. And above all, they insisted on one question that no one could clearly answer. Why would anyone, in the middle of the desert, bother to carve dinosaurs being operated on by humans? Over time, the phenomenon of the Stones of Ica fell into the uncomfortable realm where stories that do not fit reside. Most of the scientific community distanced themselves, classifying them as fraud without further analysis. Cabrera died in 2001 without having convinced the academic world, but with the peace of having left behind an immense visual archive, a stone library that still stands today. His museum still exists, although somewhat relegated to folklore. Its display cases, filled with stones that seem to narrate another story of the world, await those brave enough to look beyond what is permitted. And perhaps that is the real value of the case, that beyond their authenticity or falsehood, the Stones of Ica challenge the limits of official knowledge. They force us to reconsider our relationship with the past, with truth, with the idea of progress. Because there is something deeply disturbing in thinking that there might have been an advanced civilization before those we know. A humanity that reached impossible heights and then vanished without leaving more than engraved stones buried in the dust. Even if they were all fake, what does that say about us? What drives us to create objects like these, with so much intention to amaze, provoke, and alter the dominant narrative? What lies behind that urge to tell another story, even if with metal tools on riverstones? Perhaps the fraud, if there was one, is not in the stones but in how we choose to ignore the nuances. Because the desire for another past, for a world more complex, richer, more mysterious, is as human as the desire to understand. The Stones of Ica remain there, guarding their secret. Perhaps some of them are hundreds of years old. Perhaps none are. Perhaps the myth is stronger than the evidence, or maybe the truth is stranger than we dare to accept. In any case, they are witnesses to a unique episode where the line between archaeology and imagination becomes so thin that it ceases to matter. Because in the end, the questions they raise are worth as much as the answers we will never get. And that in itself makes them a mystery worthy of being told. The Holy Shroud of Turin. In a chamber of the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in the Italian city of Turin rests one of the most enigmatic and debated objects in Christian history. It is a long linen cloth stained by centuries, with spots, folds, and a blurry image in the center. At first glance, it appears to be just that, an old, worn cloth, patiently weathered by time. But if one stops to look closely, something unsettling is revealed. On the cloth is printed, or marked or burned or projected, the figure of a man, a naked body, wounded, stretched out in a funerary position, with marks evoking crucifixion. That image, in its form and mystery, has fascinated believers and skeptics alike for more than 6 centuries. It is the Holy Shroud of Turin, and its history is marked by faith, science, controversy, and silence. Tradition holds that this cloth was the one that wrapped the body of Jesus after his death, that it was the canvas placed hastily in the darkness of the tomb before the dawn of the 3rd day. If that were true, the shroud would literally be the most important relic in Christianity. But the story, as always happens with relics, is full of gaps. There are no continuous records precisely placing it from the 1st century until its official appearance in France in the year 1357. It is at that moment when the shroud enters the scene, in a small church in Lirey, under the protection of the family of Geoffroy de Charny, a crusader knight who claimed to have brought it from the east. Since then, the shroud has been the object of devotion and controversy. The faithful worshipped it as a miraculous imprint. The church, however, was more cautious. The very Bishop of Troyes, in a letter written decades later, labeled it as a forgery made by human hands. He said he knew who had painted it. Nevertheless, the cult continued to grow. The image of that face, with a beard, closed eyes, and serene expression, began to circulate as a symbol of Christ's passion. It was copied, reproduced, imitated. And over time, it gained an authority that not even doubt managed to extinguish. In 1578, the shroud was moved to Turin, where it remains to this day. Since then, it has been shown to the public on rare occasions, almost always in times of crisis or celebration. A chapel designed by Guarino Guarini was built for it, a jewel of Baroque architecture that for centuries protected it as if it were the very heart of Christianity. But the shroud's fame did not really take off until the 20th century, when a photograph changed everything. In 1898, photographer Secondo Pia took the first negative of the shroud, and what appeared in that negative left the world breathless. The inverted image showed a much clearer, more defined, more human portrait. The face of a real man, serene, with bloodstains, with visible wounds. It was not a painting. It was not a drawing. It was something stranger. That image seemed to give the shroud a depth not visible to the naked eye. And from then on, the debate ceased to be exclusively religious and became also a scientific enigma. Throughout the 20th century, dozens of experts from various disciplines analyzed the shroud. Physicists, chemists, forensic specialists, art historians, photographers, microbiologists, all tried to explain how that image was formed, what kind of pigment composed it, how old the cloth was. The consensus was never absolute. Some maintain it is a very sophisticated medieval fraud, others that it is a unique object that cannot be replicated with the techniques known at the time of its appearance. One of the key moments was in 1988, when 3 independent laboratories performed a carbon-14 test on small samples of the fabric. The result was clear. Between 1260 and 1390, Middle Ages, end of mystery. Or at least, that was believed for a time. Because shortly afterward, criticisms of the procedure arose. It was questioned whether the samples used belonged to a part of the shroud that may have been restored with newer threads after a fire that occurred in 1532. Others argued that contamination accumulated over centuries. Dust, candle smoke, human handling could have altered the results. In short, the dating test was put on hold, and the shroud continued to float between history and myth. What no one has been able to fully explain is how the image was formed. There are no brushstrokes, no pigments, no mechanical pressure. The body does not seem to have stained the cloth with fluids. The figure is not three-dimensional, yet it presents volume information that has even been interpreted in digital models. Some have suggested it is a spontaneous chemical reaction between the body and the linen. Others have spoken of a type of oxidation not yet reproduced in the laboratory. And there are those who, without fear of ridicule, have proposed that the image was caused by a kind of energy discharge during the resurrection, a kind of supernatural flash that left its mark on the cloth. Beyond what one may believe, the shroud has something that makes it special. It is not just the object, it is the experience it generates. Those who have seen it in person speak of a distinct presence, of an emotion that cannot be explained by arguments. It is as if the cloth contained a memory that goes beyond its composition, as if time, passing through it, had left something imprinted that still breathes. And that is hard to deny, even for those who do not believe in miracles. The Catholic Church, for its part, has maintained a cautious stance. It has neither officially declared the shroud authentic nor rejected its possibility. It considers it a venerable image, a powerful symbol, open to devotion but also to analysis. It protects it, preserves it, but does not impose it. And that ambiguity, rather than weakening it, has made it even more intriguing. Because the shroud does not force belief. It invites. It is there, like an open question. It could be a masterpiece by a brilliant forger, a pious fraud designed to move. Or it could be, as devotees claim, the most direct trace of the body of Christ. And in that crossroads between faith and science, between the tangible and the mysterious, the shroud has found its place. Perhaps it will never be known for certain what it is. Maybe that is its real function, to remind us that some things cannot be solved with a single glance, nor with a laboratory test. That not all truths need to be proven, and that not all that is inexplicable is false. The Holy Shroud of Turin remains, above all, a mirror. Everyone sees in it what they carry inside: faith, doubt, hope, or simply wonder. And as long as that possibility exists, it will continue to be one of the most fascinating objects humanity has produced. A piece of cloth that, without saying a word, has been speaking for centuries. The Klerksdorp Spheres. In the dusty depths of a South African mine, where men descend into the earth not to seek answers but minerals, objects appeared one day that should not have been there. They were neither fossils nor archaeological remains, nor pieces made by modern human hands. They were spheres, small, smooth, dark, with grooves encircling them with baffling precision. They were found in Klerksdorp, a mining town in the northwest province, known for its gold, its pyrite veins, and its geological silence. The spheres, dozens of them, were embedded in layers of pyrophyllite, a sedimentary rock estimated to be about 3 billion years old. And that is where the mystery began. Although documented by geologists since the early 20th century, the discovery did not become widely known until a handful of these spheres reached the shelves of the Klerksdorp Museum. Someone noticed their perfect shape, the grooves crossing them as if they had been lathed with precision, their balanced weight, and their metallic texture. They seemed made with intent. They appeared to be tools, toys, capsules, remnants of some forgotten artifact. And then the inevitable question arose. How is it possible for something so symmetrical, so clearly shaped, to exist inside a rock formed at a time when, according to all records, no complex life existed on Earth? Quickly, the spheres jumped from the mind's darkness into the light of speculation. Articles were published, documentaries were filmed, theories were woven. Some said they were evidence of a lost civilization, older than any known civilization. Others went further. They spoke of alien technology, visitors from the past, a previous humanity that vanished, leaving nothing but spheres buried in the bedrock. They were, they said, out-of-place objects. Proof that the history of our planet has chapters yet to be written. Conservative scholars, of course, offered a geological explanation. According to them, the Klerksdorp Spheres are nodules of hematite or goethite, common minerals that can crystallize in rounded shapes due to natural processes of pressure, temperature, and chemical deposition. The grooves around them, they claimed, result from the layering of minerals during their formation. In other words, there is no mystery. Nature can make surprising things, even shapes that appear artificial. For established science, the case was closed. But the problem was never only the shape of the spheres, it was the context. Because even if their structure can be explained from a geological point of view, the perfection with which some are shaped remains puzzling. Not all are the same. Some are rougher, others more symmetrical, but a few, those most photographed, seem to have been molded by something beyond chance. They are perfectly spherical, with bands crossing them from pole to pole, as if made with aesthetic or functional intention. And that is hard to attribute to geological randomness without at least a pause. Furthermore, there's another element that has fueled the fire of the enigma: their hardness. Some reports, often repeated but scarcely documented, claim that the spheres are so hard they cannot be scratched even by steel. This has been refuted by later analyses showing their hardness is not extraordinary, and that they can be scratched by harder materials. However, the myth was already underway. As often happens, once the mystery takes shape in the public imagination, scientific data lose weight against the narrative. The Klerksdorp matter does not rest on conclusive evidence, but on the tension between the improbable and the possible. And in that ambiguous space, everyone sees what they want to see. For some, the spheres are further proof that we have underestimated the past, that we do not truly know how many times humanity might have begun and fallen, that there are traces buried beneath layers of time that do not fit the chronology we accept as true. For others, they are simply a mineral curiosity, interesting but without implications beyond natural beauty. But the value of these spheres, beyond their origin, lies in what they represent. They are a reminder that the world still holds things we do not fully understand. That in any mine, in some little-known corner of the planet, fragments may be found that challenge the comfort of established knowledge. Not because they disprove anything, but because they open the possibility. And in that possibility, in that crack that opens between science and doubt, something filters through that we have often forgotten: the capacity for wonder. Sometimes, the problem is not that something is false, but that we prefer it to be false, so we do not have to change the way we understand the world. Because if the Klerksdorp spheres were, improbable as it seems, the product of intelligent hands from 3 billion years ago, the entire human history would have to be rewritten. And we are not ready for that. But if they are simply whims of chemistry and time, then there is nothing to fear. The mystery becomes anecdote. The wonder turns into a museum curiosity, And yet there they are, silent, round, challenging. Perhaps the best way to look at them is not from the desire to find something extraordinary, nor from the need to close the case with a technical verdict. Perhaps we should simply accept them as what they are: liminal objects, borderline, witnesses of a planet that continues to do things that puzzle us. Because even if they are natural, even if they were made by no one, their existence has the power to remind us that there is still room for the inexplicable, and that, in an increasingly saturated world of certainties, is more valuable than it seems. The Klerksdorp Spheres are not the key to a forgotten past, nor the remnant of a hidden civilization. Or perhaps they are. But what they certainly are is a mirror, one that reflects our desire to understand, our fear of uncertainty, our fascination with the shapes that time keeps in its oldest pockets. And as long as that mirror remains intact, the mystery will stay alive. The Ulfberht Swords, technology ahead of their time. In early medieval Europe, when Vikings sailed the northern seas in ships like floating blades, war was an intimate, personal, hand-to-hand matter. The weapon one wielded was not just a tool of combat. It was an extension of the soul, a symbol of status, a family heirloom, and a calling card. And among all the swords forged in that era, crude, rough iron, hammered hard over coals, there were some that did not fit their time. Swords that did not rust easily, that withstood blows without bending, that were lighter, more precise, more perfect. These weapons bore a name engraved on their blade: Ulfberht. For centuries, these swords have been found in Viking burials, often alongside high-ranking men, warriors who died with their swords still close by, as if that blade was the last barrier between them and oblivion. They were discovered on the banks of the Rhine, in Scandinavian fields, in regions as distant as Russia and the Baltic. And all shared the same unmistakable mark: a simple, powerful runic inscription written in Latin letters, Pas Ulfberht Toi, often flanked by crosses. What at first seemed like a mere maker's name or artisan brand soon became the center of a mystery that forced modern metallurgists to look at the past with new eyes. Because when analyzing the metal's composition, researchers found something unexpected. The Ulfberht swords were made with a type of steel of such high quality, so pure, that it should not have existed in Europe until several centuries later. Their carbon content was much higher than that of other contemporary swords, making them not only stronger, but also more flexible. They were not forged iron. They were steel almost on par with the famous Damascus steel, a material so refined that, for a long time, it was believed impossible to produce in Europe before the Industrial Revolution. Yet there they were, born from the embers somewhere between the 9th and 11th centuries, as if someone had turned the clock of metallurgy forward by sheer will. The question was inevitable. Where did that knowledge come from? Who forged these swords, and how did they achieve temperatures and carbon control that most European blacksmiths would not reach until almost 800 years later? Some experts began to talk about knowledge transfer. It was proposed that the makers of the Ulfberht swords could have learned advanced techniques from the Islamic world or Central Asia, where high-carbon steel was already produced in closed furnaces using specific minerals. Others went further. They suggested that the material might have been imported directly from Persia or India, regions where the so-called Wootz steel was known for its purity and strength. This hypothesis would imply not only large-scale active trade routes, but also technical understanding to transform that steel into superior weapons. The case became even stranger when it was discovered that not all Ulfberht swords were equal. Some were truly made with that near-perfect steel, while others, more numerous, were crude imitations, with the inscription copied incorrectly, even with spelling errors, as if a lower-quality smith had wanted to capitalize on the prestige of the name without having the skill or resources to match its quality. There were swords that read, Ulfberht Swords, others with reversed letters, others with poorly placed crosses. Medieval forgeries, one might say. Because even then, the good stuff was copied. This indicates that the original swords were not just tools, they were symbols. Owning an authentic Ulfberht was like having a Ferrari in a world of carts. It meant power, wealth, influence. It is likely that only the most powerful could access them. Clan chiefs, elite mercenaries, minor kings perhaps. And just as today with prestigious brands, a parallel market of fake versions arose trying to pass as genuine. To date, about 170 swords bearing the Ulfberht mark have been found. Of these, only a few possess the metallurgical characteristics that justify their legend. The rest are imitations. But even the forgeries have historical value. They are proof that in the midst of the Middle Ages, there was already a concept of brand, reputation, authorship. And that changes many ideas about how commerce and technology worked at that time. But the mystery does not end with the technique. It is still unknown who Ulfberht was. It is not known if it was a person, a family, a workshop, or a school. Some believe the name comes from a monastery or a religious order that secretly forged weapons. Something not so strange considering that medieval monks were also astronomers, scribes, brewers, and botanists. Others suggest the workshops were under the control of a network of Frankish smiths connected to the Carolingian Empire, which would explain the sword's geographic distribution and sophistication. But there is no conclusive evidence. The Ulfberht swords are an enigma because they appear when they should not, and with a quality that defies the rules of their time. They are not out of place in space, but they are in time. They are advanced pieces, as if a spark from the future had lit a fire in a forgotten European smithy. In museums where they are displayed, they are usually behind glass cases, precisely lit, separated from the public by a thin sheet of glass that does not prevent one from feeling their presence. They are not large, nor do they have exaggerated adornments, but they command respect. They have that air of objects that do not need to prove anything. One looks at them and understands that there was a time when perfection was achieved not with machines, but with hands, with fire, with patience, with secrets that perhaps were lost forever. Technology does not always progress in a straight line. Sometimes it jumps. Sometimes it forgets things it once knew. Sometimes someone discovers something, and the world is not ready to understand it. The Ulfberht swords are that, a trace, a flash of knowledge that appeared, shone, and then vanished into the medieval night. No one forged swords like these again for centuries, and perhaps that is why they fascinate, because they are made of steel and mystery, because each one is at once a tool, a work of art, and a question, because they remind us that even in the darkest centuries, someone, somewhere, knew how to make something the rest forgot. The Codex Gigas, the Devil's Bible. Within the silent walls of the National Library of Stockholm, kept under glass, with dim lighting and an almost superstitious reverence, rests one of the strangest books ever created by human hands. It is so large that a single person can barely carry it. It weighs nearly 75 kilograms, measures almost 1 meter long, and is made up of 600 parchment pages crafted from the skin of about 160 animals. But beyond its enormous size, what makes it a unique work is its aura, the mystery it has carried for centuries, and an illustration that, when opened in the middle of the volume, seems to gaze directly at anyone daring enough to look. A demon, with a grotesque body, pointed ears, and fixed eyes. This book is known as the Codex Gigas, although many simply call it the Devil's Bible. The story of this manuscript begins in the 13th century, at the Benedictine monastery of Podlajice, in what is now the Czech Republic. It was a modest abbey, without much renown, but it was there that, according to legend, a monk named Hermann the Recluse undertook an impossible task: to write, alone, the largest book in the world, a monumental work containing all the essential knowledge of his time. The complete Bible, of course, but also historical, medical, magical, and encyclopedic texts. The problem was the deadline. He had to do it in a single night, not out of ambition, but desperation. The tale, whispered through the centuries, says that the monk had been condemned to be walled up alive for a serious transgression. To avoid his punishment, he promised to write a book glorifying God so grandly that it would redeem his soul. The superiors agreed, but with a cruel condition. It had to be finished before dawn. They knew it was impossible. But the monk, facing his fate, wrote furiously for hours until, seeing that time was running out, he made a pact. Not with God, but with the devil. And it was he, according to the myth, who finished the manuscript in exchange for the author's soul. In gratitude, the monk supposedly drew the demon's portrait on a whole page, just for him, as an eternal signature of the contract sealed in darkness. Today, that story is impossible to verify. But the Codex is real. Not only does it exist, it is in an astonishing state of preservation. The pages, thick and sturdy, are written in impeccable uniform handwriting, as if done by a single hand, without pause or hesitation. That perfection has led many scholars to believe that, in fact, it could have been the work of one person working for decades. The style does not change. The ink is consistent. There are no signs of corrections or fatigue. It is an obsessive, focused work that conveys the sensation of having been written in a kind of trance. The content is equally impressive. The Codex Gigas includes a complete Latin version of the Bible, combining texts from both the Old and New Testaments. But it does not stop there. It also contains the Chronica Bohemorum, a history of Bohemia, texts by Isidore of Seville, medical treatises, magical formulas, calendars, and even monastic confessions. It is, literally, an encyclopedia of medieval knowledge. And in the midst of all that, between sacred texts and primitive science, appears him, the devil, occupying a whole page, drawn with detail, not repeated in any other fragment of the book. There is no saint, apostle, or angel portrayed in this way. Only him. That illustration has fueled legends for centuries. The demon appears crouched, with a naked body, a serpentine tongue, long nails, and an expression mixing mockery with indifference. It does not seem terrifying in the modern sense, but it is unsettling. It is trapped between two towers, as if imprisoned, or perhaps watching from its prison of ink. Opposite him, on the facing page, is a drawing of heaven, a paradisiacal vision of the celestial city. It is a deliberate contrast, good and evil, facing each other through the pages, and the message requires no words. The Codex Gigas passed from hand to hand for centuries. It was once in the hands of Emperor Rudolf II, a lover of occultism and alchemy. It was in Prague, in imperial libraries, and then taken as loot by Swedish troops during the 30 Years' War. That is how it arrived in Stockholm, where it has remained ever since, guarded, studied, and also feared. Because some say the book is cursed, that it brings misfortune to whoever owns it, that it is better not to open it for too long. Not out of superstition, they say, but because some books hold an energy beyond what is seen. Modern studies have tried to strip the Codex of its dark cloak. It has been digitized, the parchment, ink, and writing patterns analyzed. Nothing indicates it was made all at once, nor in a single night, nor by supernatural means. But neither has it been possible to determine exactly how long it took to write, nor who exactly the author was. Some believe it was a monk punished with voluntary seclusion. Others think it was a lifelong project, a work of penance. The only clear fact is that it is a work made with extraordinary determination, unparalleled in its time. and that is what makes it so powerful. Because beyond the legend of the pact with the devil, what the Codex Gigas reflects is the intensity of a will. Someone, whoever they were, decided to enclose in a single book all knowledge, all truths, all questions, all possibilities of redemption and damnation. There is no rest on its pages. Everything is there. The divine and the earthly, the medical and the magical, the historical and the apocalyptic. It is as if the writer did not want to leave anything out, as if they knew this work would be their only legacy, their only shield against oblivion. Today, the Codex Gigas remains an object of study, theories, fascination. Documentaries, books, forensic analyses have been made, but nothing has fully dissolved its mystery, because there is something that cannot be measured with microscopes or carbon dating. The feeling. The one you experience when you see it, even in photos, imagining the author writing night after night, surrounded by silence, while the world outside faded and the pages grew. That idea, more than any legend, is what keeps the Codex alive. And perhaps that is why its nickname does not sound exaggerated, the Devil's Bible. Not because it glorifies the demon, but because it was born from a human darkness that at times is as deep as any hell. The Seraphinian Codex, the strangest book ever written. Not all doors to mystery open in the distant past, among ruins or bones covered by centuries of dust. Some appear right in the 20th century, with the clarity of print, with vivid colors, with modern paper, yet wrapped in an enigma so deep it disarms even the most curious readers. The Seraphinian Codex is one of those doors, a book written in a language no one can read, illustrated with images that follow no human logic, and conceived as a complete work that cannot be easily explained. A book that does not come from an ancient temple or a lost civilization, but from the mind of a single man, alive, Italian, architect and artist, Luigi Serafini. First published in 1981, the Codex appeared as if it came from another planet. It has the structure of an encyclopedia, with well-divided chapters, symmetrical margins, careful diagrams, titles in consistent typefaces. But its contents do not resemble anything. Its pages are written in an invented alphabet, with characters that seem to mix Arabic, Cyrillic, and hieroglyphic scripts, without any equivalent in any known language. There is no possible translation, no keys, no glossaries. It is a language closed upon itself, impossible to decipher. And yet, it is read, or at least, it is attempted. Because although the words say nothing recognizable, the images speak, and what they say is pure wonder. Each page of the Codex is a window to a world that defies categories. There are impossible animals, fish with horse legs, birds growing out of plants, creatures that change shape without warning. There are scenes that seem scientific, with microscopes and dissections, but the internal organs are neither human nor from any earthly species. There are machines that float, that melt, that reproduce. There are diagrams of rituals, sports, social relationships that do not respond to any known culture. There are maps of continents that do not exist, stars orbiting in absurd directions, alphabets within alphabets. It is as if someone wanted to explain a parallel world with the seriousness of an 18th century illustrated naturalist, but using a logic completely foreign to ours. There is no explicit humor, no irony. Everything is presented with an almost scientific solemnity, and that makes it even more puzzling, because one does not know if they are facing a parody, a conceptual artwork, a philosophical provocation, or an endless hall of mirrors. The truth is that the effect is hypnotic. One turns the pages without understanding anything, and at the same time, with the certainty that something important is happening there. For years, the book was considered an unsolvable mystery. Some thought it hid a coded message. that the invented language was actually a code that could be broken. There were those who tried to find mathematical patterns, repetitions, symmetries that would reveal a key. But Serafini himself has said that there is no such code, that the language means nothing, that it was written from a state of flow, of free association, as if his hand knew something his mind could not translate. He compared it to the way children flip through books before learning to read. They see the letters, they know there is a message, but they do not understand it. That state of pure fascination, of reading without meaning, is what he wanted to recreate. And perhaps that is where its genius lies. Because the Seraphinian Codex is not a book to understand, but to experience. It is a reading that is not done with the rational mind, but with intuition, with imagination, with the part of the brain that daydreams. Its impossible language works as a key that opens a door without a hallway, that leads to a place without a map. And once inside, one does not want to leave. Serafini has never fully explained the purpose of the Codex, and that is part of the game. He has said in interviews that it is not a hidden message, nor a satire of scientific knowledge, although some have read it that way. That it is not a work of science fiction, though it has something of that. That it is not an invented religion either, although there are scenes that recall rituals and cosmologies. It is simply what it is, an artifact that simulates being an encyclopedia of another universe, with its own rules, its own aesthetics, its own logic. Some critics have compared the Codex to the works of Borges, to the novels of Italo Calvino, to the impossible maps of Escher, or the mental landscapes of Salvador Dalí. And they are not wrong. It has something of all of them, but it also has its own voice, a style unlike anything before. Serafini did not create a book within a tradition, but one that inaugurates its own. And that is what makes it so unclassifiable. The Codex has also influenced visual artists, musicians, designers. Bands have used it as cover art. Authors have cited it as inspiration. Academics have written essays about its symbolism, even though the author insists it has no fixed meaning. The mere fact that so many people want to make sense of something that refuses to have it already says a lot about its impact. Because we are used to seeking structure, intention, explanation. And the Seraphinian Codex slips through our hands, again and again. Today, the book is published in deluxe editions, with thick covers, with faithful reproductions of the original drawings. It is sold in art bookstores, displayed in glass cases, consulted in silence like one opening a grimoire. It has readers all over the world, people who contemplate it as one looks at a distant star, knowing they will never reach it, but grateful that it exists. And perhaps that is its true purpose. Not to be understood, but to remind us that there are forms of knowledge that do not go through reason. That there are worlds built from intuition, from art, from the ineffable. The Seraphinian Codex is a map without territory, a mirror without reflection, a language spoken without a mouth. It is, in the best sense, an unsolvable enigma. And in an age obsessed with having answers for everything, that feels like an act of resistance. Thus ends this series of mysteries, with a book that cannot be explained but also cannot be ignored. A book that, without belonging to the remote past or any lost civilization, is surrounded by a silence just as deep. Because what is not understood does not always need to be solved. Sometimes, it is enough just to keep staring, like one who contemplates a dream from which they do not want to wake. And so we reach the end of the video. The story is full of shadows, and some like these still brush against us. Thank you for joining me once again. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring what they never told us. Good night.